Hi, I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental topics that green up our world. If you live in Washtenaw County, you most likely have heard about the plume of dioxane that's contaminated 3 square miles of Ann Arbor's groundwater. To talk with us about that issue is Dan Hamel, project manager of the GELMAN site for the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a really complex issue, and we have very little time. There's a lot of past history, but what I'm going to do is just read some bullet points of past history, and then we'll get into what's going on in the present moment.
All right.
So please bear with me. If I say anything wrong, correct me, feel free. Okay, so first off, we're talking about 1,4-dioxane and not dioxin, which is a different chemical. It's a chemical that was discharged to the environment on Ann Arbor's west side from 1966 to 86 by GELMAN Sciences, which used dioxane as a solvent to manufacture medical filters. The plume is spread in the groundwater to over 3 square miles. GELMAN Sciences is pumping up the water, removing the dioxane, and discharging the water to Honey Creek. After 25 years of treatment, they've removed about 13% of the dioxane in the plume. Dioxane is not yet federally regulated, but they're considering looking into that. It's been designated by the EPA as a probable human carcinogen. Currently, they recommend staying below 3.5 parts per billion in drinking water for a 1 in 100,000 cancer risk. Michigan's new safe level is 7.2 parts per billion, down from the previous 85 parts per billion. The city of Ann Arbor tests its water regularly for dioxane. It's never been found in the tap water here. The GELMAN site is currently being overseen by the Washtenaw County Circuit Court via a consent judgment, which is an agreement between GELMAN and the state, which allows the plume to stay in the ground rather than being cleaned up as long as human contact is prohibited. This area where it must stay is called the prohibition zone. There's evidence it's not staying in place. It's now being found in shallow groundwater on Ann Arbor's west side. GELMAN Sciences has changed hands twice. First, the company was bought by Paul Life Sciences, and they in turn were purchased by the Danaher Corporation. But we use the name GELMAN Sciences because that's the responsible party that is named in the consent judgment. Phew, whirlwind tour of a lot that's been going on.
A little correction.
Okay.
You had said about that it's not staying in place and it has been found in shallow groundwater. Where it has been found in the shallow groundwater is still within the prohibition zone on the west side. So it is in the prohibition zone. It was detected in shallow groundwater, but we haven't really determined if that detection in that shallow groundwater is related or from GELMAN.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
All right, and we're going to talk really briefly about numerous changes that have happened this last year. We're going to warn the audience that it's going to be a really light treatment. If you want to hear more about, learn more about all this, there's a lot of resources that we're going to be talking about at the end. So the first big change in this past year was last fall. The DQ announced that the new safe level would go down from 85 parts per billion to 7.2. And that we know is going to impact the people on well water in terms of if they have water above 7.2, then they will be put on city water or bottled water, right?
Correct.
Okay, so to get a handle on what we're looking at in terms of changes with this new level, are there people on well water in Washtenaw County that whose water tests above 7.2?
We sample water supply wells yearly as part of our work on the GELMAN site. In 2016, we sampled approximately 102 water supply wells. None of the water supply wells were above 7.2. We had 2 wells that had a 1 part per billion detection, and 1 water supply well had 2 parts per billion.
Okay. And those are of interest because of the some people are saying we should go lower than 7.2, that, you know, the EPA has mentioned the 3.5 as being an advisory level, and some states such as New Jersey, Colorado, Massachusetts, and California are even testing and treating to lower than 1. Well, California it's 1 and the other 3 are even lower. So that's good to know. And how about the people on city water? With the current agreement, the consent judgment, will the 7.2 level mean a better cleanup?
Well, the 7.2 level means that some additional work has to be done related to the GELMAN site and related to the contamination. We hope that GELMAN will voluntarily do additional investigation activities related to the groundwater contamination at 7.2. If they don't, then we're prepared to go to court and request that they be instructed to complete those activities.
And when you say activities, do you mean testing?
Testing. There are currently over 250 monitoring wells, so continuation of the testing of those monitoring wells, when and how many times a year, potentially installation of additional monitoring wells to investigate the groundwater contamination to the 7.2 criteria.
And where you might put those?
That's part of the negotiations,
Okay.
and the negotiations right now are confidential.
Okay.
You know, my attorney, the Michigan Attorney General, those negotiations are confidential right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I really couldn't say, other than there is discussion of, installation of additional monitoring wells.
Okay. So another new change is that last fall they tested the shallow groundwater, because I guess the groundwater gets more shallow as it gets closer to the river. Is that right?
Yes, potentially.
Yep.
The groundwater gets more shallow.
Uh-huh. And they tested the water there and found that some of the water that was coming in contact with basements did have some levels of dioxane in it. Could you tell us what levels they found there?
Well, first off, they tested the shallow groundwater. We didn't confirm that any of that groundwater is in contact with basements of residences. There were 16 locations that were tested, that temporary monitor wells were installed and sampled and tested for dioxane. At 2 of the locations, there were concentrations of 2 to 3 parts per billion.
Okay. And is that a red flag? Is that level a level that you're going to do something about it?
Well, currently, again, as part of the recent change to the criteria, a screening level of 29 parts per billion was identified as a screening level to be used to evaluate shallow groundwater in contact with basements. So concentrations of 2 to 3 parts per billion is significantly below that 29.
So 29 is the red flag level.
29
that's
is
the level
that's
where
a screening
you
level.
Start doing more
additional
testing
work to see
okay.
if there is an actual risk related to dioxane contamination in groundwater that is in contact with the basement.
Okay.
I do want to stress that that screening level is related to if contaminated groundwater is in contact with the basement.
And at what level would the air in people's homes be tested if there's like vapors that have dioxane in it?
What level? I'm not quite sure of the question.
The 29, is it at 29 parts per billion in the
29 parts per billion is the concentration in the shallow groundwater. The levels that in indoor air, I really don't have that, can't answer that question.
Are you planning on testing that at all?
No, currently there's no plans to go test indoor air. There are plans to continue our evaluation related to shallow groundwater and comparison to the screening level. If
the levels were high enough in the water, then you would start testing the air.
Well, we would evaluate to see if that was the logical next step.
Yeah. All right, another big change is that the Washtenaw County judge that is overseeing this is now Tim Connors, and he has allowed the city and the county and the Huron River Watershed Council to be plaintiffs in the case, right?
Correct.
And these entities are pushing for a better cleanup. So first of all, could this go to trial instead of just simply a consent judgment, which is more of a settlement?
As I understand it, the goal of those negotiations is to come up with a mutually agreeable modification to the consent judgment to take to the judge and have the court implement that. If that goal cannot be accomplished, mutually agreeable modification of the consent judgment, then yes, it would go to court and require a judgment from the court on a modification to the consent judgment.
Okay, regardless of whether it goes to trial or not, there's many variables that could change, right? So I'm just going to throw a bunch of ideas out. For instance, the treatment process. Some people are not happy that the current treatment process that GELMAN is using is ozone oxidation because it has the byproduct of bromate, which is a known carcinogen. Is there a chance that the treatment process could change?
Again, that would be brought up in the negotiations of the consent judgment. If that is where that treatment process would be changed with the change to the consent judgment. So is there a possibility that would be the outcome? Mm-hmm. You know, it would have to be determined, you know, with those negotiations or a court judgment.
Okay. And how much water is being treated and how fast? There's a lot of people saying we need more stepped up treatment. Now, what's the challenge? All that volume of water, if we step up the treatment. We've got problems with erosion, I've heard, possibly with Honey Creek, right?
Right. Currently they're pumping around 500 gallons a minute and treating 500 gallons a minute and discharging that to Honey Creek. The current permit that they are working under does allow them to pump up to 1,300 gallons a minute. If that would increase, then yes, there are potential concerns that additional discharge could cause erosion.
And is there a chance that there could be an alternative to Honey Creek for taking the discharge?
Yes, there are alternatives, and they will, if required, if needed, they will be evaluated.
Like what? Like, for instance, a pipeline. I've heard a pipeline from the treatment plant on the west side of Ann Arbor directly to the river downstream of Barton Pond?
Yes, historically that was evaluated previously. Again, that was before my time, but as in reading some of the history, there was some disagreement from the community of they didn't really like that at that time to have a pipeline going through the community like that. But a pipeline could be evaluated as an alternative if additional pumping is decided by a change to the consent judgment by the court.
Another variable that might be looked at is the level of dioxane that's being allowed to be discharged in the water. You know, after they treat it, they don't take out all the dioxane apparently. And right now, when it goes into Honey Creek, that eventually gets into Barton Pond, which is the city's water supply. So could that possibly change that allowable level? Yes, that could
possibly change. Again, that was evaluated. The current permit was issued in 2016. Those concentrations were evaluated at that time, and again, the permit was issued with a daily limit, maximum limit, and a monthly maximum limit. So that, with a change in treatment, change in volume, that also could be evaluated to see if that needed changed, permit needed adjusted and modified.
And how about the testing level, the sensitivity? I've heard some people say that we should be testing to less than 1 part per billion, which is the current, because that way we could have a better heads up as to where the plume might be spreading to.
Well, the methods that are used by the DEQ lab and the GELMAN lab are EPA approved methods with a reporting limit, like you said, of 1 part per billion. We feel that is adequate with a criteria of 7.2.
I just was curious, what do the monitoring wells look like? If we get a lot more monitoring wells, are there going to be structures all around the neighborhood, or what would it look like?
Most of the monitoring wells in areas that are what I'll call high traffic areas and right-of-ways in that way are what we call flush mount monitoring wells, which basically look like a very small manhole cover that is surrounded by cement, concrete. In areas where that don't have high traffic, the monitoring wells usually have a protective casing that stick up above the ground to make it easier access a couple of feet, and that are locked. And all these monitoring wells do have locks on them so people can't get in them.
And are the surface waters and the county drains going to be sampled more?
Yes, we sampled surface waters, seeps, and ponds, and in 2016 we do plan to sample the additional surface water seeps, drains in 2017. We will work with county and the city of Ann Arbor and also other stakeholders to identify locations to be sampled in 2017, but we are planning on sampling surface waters in 2017 also.
How about monitoring the health histories of people that have been exposed to dioxane? Especially interested in the people that were exposed to at really high levels when the contamination was first found and they'd been drinking really high levels in their well water. Could that be something that might be part of the new plan?
It isn't currently being discussed. Again, that probably will, would be a discussion that would include the Department of Health and Human Services, another state agency. I don't know of any plans right now to conduct those types of activities, but that could be an activity that could be done in the future if it is warranted.
Okay, and development of contingencies. Some people feel we need to know what could happen if Barton Pond water was contaminated, such as do we hook up to Detroit River water, or do we build a plant like they have in Tucson, Arizona that actually treats the water as it comes up from the groundwater and before it gets into the city water system? So could that be part of the new?
Well, that is part of the ongoing current negotiations with GELMAN, is to identify contingencies related to water supply wells being impacted, and then also larger supplies being impacted. I do want to make it clear that we have no information right now that the contamination is moving toward Barton Pond.
Right.
But again, those types of what you're identifying as contingencies are part of the current negotiations that we are conducting with GELMAN.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes. What about the financial assurance mechanism, which is the $28 million of GELMAN Sciences money that's currently in the bank in case they were not to fulfill their duties under the consent judgment? Could that amount of money change?
Yes, it can. In fact, that FAM, Financial Assurance Mechanism, is evaluated every 5 years under the current consent judgment. But if the consent judgment is modified, that will be evaluated and adjusted accordingly. So that will be part of the modification, included in any modification to the consent judgment.
Okay, so new changes. The petition was accepted to have the GELMAN site be considered for a Superfund site. So that is news, but I've heard that the EPA says that because there's a responsible party that's currently fulfilling their duties under the consent agreement, that it's not likely that they would get involved. But if there's a new judge and new plaintiffs, and they come up with a new plan, and the responsible party doesn't feel that that's going to work for them, then could the state ask the EPA that they might want some help with this?
Well, again, the site is currently being regulated under the Washtenaw County Court. So initially there would be court action, court decisions related to any required changes to the consent judgment. But yes, if the DEQ could ask for assistance from the EPA, if the GELMAN doesn't fulfill the court requirements.
All right, and probably the most obvious change in the last year or so has been the heightened awareness and concern because of the Flint water crisis about water quality in general. Do property owners in the area need to disclose that there's groundwater beneath their homes that have dioxane in it, or that their wells might be in the path of the spreading plume? Well,
in the current environmental law, which is I identify as Part 201, there is a section that says that if property owners know that there is contamination, that they must notify potential buyers, purchasers, of that contamination or of any land or resource use restrictions, which would be the prohibition zone. So there is a section in the current environmental law that requires that.
Okay. And in terms of whether or not it's really a risk, does the DEQ feel that human health is at risk with this situation?
Well, we have been, like I said, working with GELMAN to ensure that no one is at risk from the drinking water contamination from dioxane. The more recent identification of dioxane as a vapor intrusion issue, we are continuing our investigation along the, to make sure that that is not a possibility. The initial information, like I said, doesn't indicate that there is a current risk, but we will be evaluating that over the next year, and as part of any new investigation or modifications of the consent judgment.
All right, well, we are out of time, unfortunately. So we're going to just talk about the different resources that are available, really briefly. Now, I know the DEQ has been putting together a long list of resources. How can people get a hold of that?
The DEQ has a GELMAN webpage that can be accessed through the internet. You can Google DEQ GELMAN, and the address to that webpage is on there. On that webpage, we post all the data and information that we receive or generate for the GELMAN site. And
your contact info is there.
My contact information is there.
Okay. And then there's SIO Residents for Safe Water. That's srsw.org. And on that, they can get the videos of all the town hall meetings and all kinds of things. There's just tons and tons of information there.
Right. That's a webpage that is supported by a local stakeholder that's interested in the GELMAN site.
Okay. And then if you Google MLive Ann Arbor Dioxane, you'll get a long list of Ryan Stanton's excellent articles. If you Google WEMU Green Room, you'll get the 25-part series. Or you can just go right to dioxane.org. You can get that there as well. If you Google Washtenaw County CARD, C-A-R-D, which stands for, help me, Dan.
Coalition for the
Action on Remediation of Dioxane. Okay. That has a lot of great resources. And there's the Washtenaw County fact sheet.
Right. And Washtenaw County, on that CARD webpage, there are fact sheets that were generated by Washtenaw County.
The EPA fact sheet,
there's an
you
EPA
can just
fact
Google EPA dioxane fact sheet.
And I can also, if you can contact me, and I can give you the web addresses for where this information can be acquired.
There's a lot of information. There's a lot that they're trying to figure out, but there's a lot out there as well.
Yes, there is.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
For an online archive of all our Green Room shows, go to ewashtenaw.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.